Good evening, ladies and gentlemen who are watching afar. My name is John Ward. I am the Deputy Mayor and I am chairing this council as the Mayor is currently indisposed. Before we start our formal official business, I am going to read a statement from the council about the situation in the Ukraine. I'm sorry, I have to use my other glasses. Here we go. Like millions around the world, excuse me, I'm sure that residents in Waverley have looked on with horror at the escalating situation in Ukraine. The shocking violence, bombings and attacks by an invading army are something that many of us thought we would never see again in Europe. It is an unprovoked attack on a sovereign, democratic nation by an autocratic rogue state. It is also more than that. It is an attack on the values of open and free democracies everywhere. We have seen in the last couple of days that the Russian government has banned all traditional and social media outlets, except those that are controlled and run by the Russian state. In Russia, it is now a crime punishable by up to 15 years in prison to be a free-thinking journalist or to share factual information about the current war situation. In seeking to destroy the democracy in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has also abandoned any pretense that democracy currently exists in Russia, and we feel for the ordinary Russian people. On behalf of Waverley Borough Council, we condemn the actions of Vladimir Putin and the Russian government and express horror at the disregard for human life, national sovereignty, and the international rule of law. We urge the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw their troops, and we also call on the UK government and its NATO allies to offer the maximum possible humanitarian aid and military support. As is usual in these circumstances, the people that will suffer most will be the civilians. And few can fail to have been moved by the plight of the people of Ukraine, who have so far demonstrated unbelievable strength and character in response to this horrific attack. All our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine, and especially with our Ukrainian colleagues in local government who struggle against insurmountable odds to continue to support their communities. Above all, we hope for a speedy return to peace and security and a brighter future in a free and democratic Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you to stand for a few moments in silence in solidarity of the victims of this terrible onslaught. Thank you. Well, once again, welcome to this meeting of Waverley Borough Council, which, excuse me one second, which is reconvening from our adjourned meeting on Tuesday, the 22nd of February, which ended eventually at 10:59 p.m. Only the outstanding business from that meeting will be dealt with here. The meeting tonight is being held here in the Godalming United Church, which is the new venue for us. So please bear with anything that doesn't quite work the way it normally does in the council chamber. However, we do need to have this in order to have COVID secure spacing which currently would not be available in the council chamber. Members, please raise your hand and wave when you wish to speak. I will acknowledge you. Please note that I appear to have been wearing my wrong pair of glasses, so you may have to wave vigorously, but I'm sure that will be fine. I can also confirm, obviously, that we are webcasting this. Speeches will, as usual, be timed to 4 minutes, and you will hear a 30-second warning before the end of your speech. Obviously, you normally cannot speak twice, except in limited circumstances, which are set out in our rules of procedure. Okay, thank you. You will all have received from the monitoring officer a communication about how we should be conducting ourselves here. I think I would sum up what he said, and I'll add a little bit to it. He has said, please respect each other. The bit he left out, which I hope you will do, is please be kind to the Deputy Mayor. It's his first time in the job. Okay, we will move on to item 1, apologies for absence. Louise.
I'll pick those up, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So we have received apologies from councillors Kevin Deaners, Jan Floyd Douglas, Maxine Gale, John Gray, Brian Edmonds, Daniel Hunt, Peter Isherwood, Anna James, Jackie Keane, Robert Knowles, Michaela Martin, Kika Miralles, John Rubini, Anne-Marie Rosamond, George Wilson, Julia Potts, Simon Deere, and Trevor Sadler.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to item 9 on our original programme, which is minutes of the executive. We finished the part 1 items and all the ones that had to be done for decision. So we are now into part 2 items. I have 3 registered speakers on 5 topics. And the first one I have is Councillor Cossa on trees and woodland policy. Councillor Cossa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Mayor. It caught me unawares there. I didn't expect to be first up, but thank you for that. Before coming to the main point I want to raise on this item this evening, I would like to recall my general welcome for the tree and woodland policy to which I'm referring and its associated action plan. In particular, it does seem to me that it goes beyond the policy and action plan, containing, as it does, a number of very helpful procedures and guidance. It's certainly the product of a lot of work and a lot of knowledge, I think, by officers, for which I think they must be commended. And I believe it will make a significant contribution to the management of the council's woodland stock. However, there is one issue in relation to this I do feel I need to draw the attention of council to. In early January, the document was put out to consultation to county, parishes and others with a very short and quite inadequate deadline for comments of the 14th of January. Around the 9th of January, the draft policy was published in papers for the executive meeting of the 16th of January with a request that the plan be approved at that meeting. Whilst it was quite clear from the report that the executive considered that, unsurprisingly, many had found it impossible to in such a timescale, the executive teams happily approved the plan without any consideration of the fact that not only had it been impossible for many to respond, but that the report contained no detail of the comments from those who would have found time to respond. I think perhaps it would be courteous to the council if either the leader or the appropriate portfolio holder could advise us what the point is of consulting if insufficient time is allocated to the consultation process and feedback is not considered before a decision is reached. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Costa. I have also one other speaker on this item before I will ask the leader or portfolio holder to respond, and that is Councillor Seaborn.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. The new tree and woodland policy is very thorough in addressing the maintenance and health of our existing stock of trees, noting their importance for sequestering carbon. But the concept of offsetting CO2 emissions by additional tree planting, while alluded to, is not given any great priority. Indeed, the word offsetting does not appear once in the entire document. I'd like to highlight some limitations to the linkage between the new tree and woodland policy and the Carbon Neutrality Action Plan, which don't seem to have been picked up by the Executive when approving the policy. The Carbon Neutrality Action Plan contains specific reference to, and there are 3 points, the Council investigating all possible options to sequester carbon locally, including tree preservation and afforestation. Second point, production of a tree and woodland management policy and action plan by 2021 to establish the sequestering potential in the borough. And the third item, in short-term action L4, make a tree and woodland management policy taking a sustainable approach to planting, provide succession for tree stock that are able to cope for future diseases and pests, and the opportunity to offset carbon. Because of the long time it takes a tree to reach maturity and full carbon sequestration capacity, new planting is not going to have a meaningful impact on the Council's targets carbon neutrality by 2030, but it could make us a measurable contribution to offsetting emissions by 2040 and beyond. To make a meaningful contribution to CO2 sequestration, trees would have to be planted in large numbers, tens of thousands. This would require tens of hectares of land and would, of course, have a material cost for the provision of saplings, clearance of land, and for labour to plant and maintain the new stock. So, Mr. Deputy Mayor, can I suggest that the tree and woodland policy should give rather more priority to the issue of offsetting called for in the Carbon Neutrality Action Plan? This document is good as it is, but it feels rather like business as usual and not the response to an emergency. I hope the administration will look to up the level of urgency on assessing the potential contribution of additional planting. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Seaborn. Leader, do you or one of the Executive wish to reply?
I'll reply on this one, Mr. Mayor, if that's Mr. Deputy Mayor, if that's all right. Regarding the consultation, I appreciate in this particular case, as with others during COVID, the consultation process has not been ideal. I don't believe any COVID consultation process has been particularly ideal because we have been unable in most of those instances to host any in-person consultation or do any of that sort of nature. And I suspect, depending on who I spoke to, a consultation would never be long enough or short enough for some, depending on who I spoke to. In terms of other consultation that took place, the ONS did review this document, which I attended and the portfolio holder attended. And those comments were taken on board. The other point I would very quickly make is that this document is effectively going to be considered going forward as well. It is not something that we're going to set in stone. It is something that we are able to change and amend going forward. The urgency that Councillor Seaborn spoke of is also the urgency why we need to get such a document in place so we can start managing this now. Consultation responses won't be forgotten, but they'll be incorporated into a future version. In terms of Councillor Seaborn's other points, the tree and woodland offsetting, I mean, I concur it is a factor, but the point you made regarding the length of time it takes a tree to grow to maturity before it starts making that kind of contribution is significant, and certainly in many cases either greater than or in excess of the planned period. So of course we'll be planting more trees. Surrey County Council are allegedly planting more trees too. The urgency is clear, though. This document has been necessary for a long time, and I'll conclude by echoing the comments that were made by both members, that this is an excellent piece of work, a lot of work from officers, and it was important that it got in now and is being used. With your consent, Mr. Mayor, I believe the portfolio holder at the time was Councillor Townsend, who would probably like to make a couple of comments too.
She is indicating like mad, so Councillor Townsend.
Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to catch your attention. I'd just like to say that, point of clarity, that this document is management of our own tree stock and our own woodland, that is Waverley's, on Waverley's land. The subject of offsetting, we are actually dealing with that in our biodiversity strategy, which will be coming forward, and hopefully Councillor Seaborne and members of the ONS will bring their comments forward to executive on those points within that particular strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Townsend. The next speaker I have is again Councillor Seaborne on Carbon Neutrality Action Plan. Councillor Seaborne.
Thank you again, Mr. Deputy Mayor. It's good to see the Carbon Neutrality Action Plan evolving. I'd like to commend all the hard work put in by officers. I'd like to use this opportunity to repeat a reasonably straightforward question that I asked as executive on 8th of February, which inspired the portfolio holder to deliver a 5-minute sermon on topics ranging from the evils of big oil companies to his perception that COP26 was a failure. Unfortunately, the passionate response, while covering many things, neatly avoided addressing the question that I had posed. The administration has set a target of 2030 for the elimination or offsetting of just over 17,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions from the council's operations and from the stock of owned housing. In March 2020, executive were presented with a draft of the Carbon Neutrality Action Plan containing a theoretical linear trajectory for CO2 removal, which included housing stock emissions. By December 2020, when Council was presented with version 1 of the plan, the trajectory had morphed into a theoretical asymptotic curve minus the 70% contribution of the 2015-16 baseline from council house emissions. Figure 5 in the latest version of the action plan is now based on data rather than theory, which is a big step forward, but it fails to address the large contribution from our housing stock. The text also correctly points out that the trajectory has been distorted by the reduced level of emissions from leisure centres due to periods of closure in response to COVID measures. So when are we going to see a trajectory that is based on data rather than theory, and which reflects the reduction in emissions from council housing stock, noting that both the costs and the logistical challenges of retrofitting 4,700 plus houses in around 2,000 working days, which reflects the removal of the full anticipated emissions from our leisure centres, and which includes offsetting from whatever source, as we've just considered in the Tree and Woodland Management Plan. Such a trajectory will enable Council to judge the viability of reaching the 2030 target for net zero operational emissions, and will enable progress to be tracked. I fully appreciate that the housing team is doing some excellent work to evaluate the housing stock and is planning to carry out some retrofit trials which will inform the way forward. That's why I'm asking the question, when will we have an inclusive database trajectory, rather than asking the question of why don't we have one? I realise that the answer is not tomorrow, but 2.5 years into a declared climate emergency, it seems to me that it's high time that we do understand where we're actually going, rather than where we would like to go. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Seaborne. Leader, do you or Portfolio Holder wish to reply?
Though I'm sure it's the right place for a sermon from any of us, I will defer to Councillor Williams on this occasion if he would like.
I think the response to Councillor Seaborne is actually fairly simple. The Carbon Neutrality Action Plan is a living document. The quality of the data, which Councillor Seaborne has been very critical of, has actually been successively improved as a result of the work that's actually gone on over the last couple of years in spite of the COVID pandemic, we have continued to treat the climate emergency as an emergency and have responded accordingly. As Councillor Seaborne is aware, we do have a housing asset management strategy in process at the moment. We do have an audit being undertaken, and we do have a trial being undertaken of in terms of decarbonising our properties. As Councillor Seaborne is aware, there is a gap in the data for our carbon footprint as a council, and that could well be associated with the fact that when I became the portfolio holder for environment and sustainability, there was absolutely nobody who held the role as an officer for sustainability. There was no sustainability team in place in May 2019. We are now moving to a situation where we have where we have a sustainability team that will be four once the new appointment that is in process as we speak is appointed, and our carbon neutrality action plan, although we are never complacent about it, was actually ranked 5th in the UK in terms of the UK climate emergency the scorecard that was produced by Climate Emergency UK. So in terms of questioning the data, we are in the process of improving and refining the data all the time, and we are in the process, as Councillor Seaborne is well aware, of developing plans for a leisure centre in Cranley, a brand new leisure centre in Cranley, which will be world beating in terms of its sustainability. And we have set as a standard for that, that it is Passive House standard as a minimum standard. And we are seeking to secure a zero carbon leisure centre. And my understanding of it is that there is perhaps one in the world at the moment of that standard. So, as I say, our data is being improved all the time, and we are working both in terms of decarbonising our housing stock and also in terms of decarbonising our leisure centres, and work is proceeding on that as we speak.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. The next question I have is from Councillor Hyman, and it is on capital projects. Councillor Hyman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I think we're dotting backwards and forwards between the two executive meetings minutes, aren't we? Are we on? Just bear with us, Councillor Hyman. Is this page 8 of the separate document that was sent? Yes. The pavilions, obviously, it's a very good thing to see that hopefully there's going to be some action on the Bourne Pavilion. It's good that we've got some money available here, but what concerned me was that when I mentioned to someone that it was going to be done, they asked me about the skate park. Are we going to do anything about the skate park, which does need small amounts of work? And that raised the question of how these projects are chosen and what are the criteria. I must admit I was unable to answer the question of who is it. In our papers here, halfway up the page, on page 8, it says it's the projects coordinating group was formed to consider discretionary projects. Are we able to find out somewhere who they are so I can tell people, because obviously those are the people who would need to be influenced, and how and when they would need influencing. Really, I'm wondering whether I should be concerned that there doesn't seem to have been wider member involvement or debate in this, and it just simply went in front of the executive, as far as I can tell, and got pushed through. I'm very happy that money's being spent on the pavilions, but nevertheless, there are other things which need money spending on, and we need to be able to know how we can put them forward. So if you could explain to me If someone could explain that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Leader, do you or a portfolio holder wish to respond?
Councillor Merriweather will respond. Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Hyman, for your question. So the way these projects are identified is by the officers, and the officers put together a case, and that case goes through to a prioritisation process. In the past, they have then, after being scored, end up in the budget. But you'll recall a couple of years ago, we allowed ourselves some flexibility during the year by ring fencing a certain amount of money. I think it was about £360,000 for this year, which wasn't attributed to specific projects at the time of doing the budget, simply because there was so much demand. And so many unforeseeable things, we wanted to assess these things during the course of the year, which is why the projects coordinating group was set up to allocate this. It's the relevant portfolio holders, it's me, I think Councillor Townsend, Councillor Williams as well. And we review the bids that are put forward by the officers and allocate the funds as best we can, not forgetting that there is an almost infinite demand and extremely finite resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. I have Councillor Hyman again on service plans. Councillor Hyman.
Yeah, this is difficult because obviously the service plans documents aren't in front of us, but the issue that I had the time, don't think I mentioned at the executive at the time, it seems an awful long time ago. The issue was that in respect of air quality, the service plans did not identify that the obligatory statutory duty that we have to have an air quality action plan that is scheduled and funded. Obviously, it's Surrey County Council who are the people who have to do the work where it's where roads are involved or where the solutions are through new traffic provisions or whatever, or controls. But I am concerned that in not recognising it in the service plans, because of the way it seems to have been treated over the past 3 years or so, air quality issues have been effectively delegated to Surrey County Council through the Farnham Board, which is an abrogation of our responsibility. It is Waverley's responsibility to have an air quality action plan, and we then can hold Surrey County Council to account if they do not effectively populate that plan for us and produce a schedule and funded a plan to achieve the legal limits. So I am very concerned. I'd like some sort of confirmation that we will not be abrogating our responsibility and that we are not going to just leave it to the Farnham Infrastructure Project, which of course is basically Tim Oliver. He's the person who runs it, so it's the Surrey executive. We can't be doing this. I realise that as I did not put a question to in writing in advance, I can't expect an answer, but I really do just want to flag up that it's a very important thing. It's been ignored since 2008. We haven't had an action plan. It's now 14 years later. It's about time that we really did something about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Leader, do you or a portfolio holder wish to respond?
I may defer to Councillor Williams.
Yes, Councillor Hyman is absolutely correct that an updated air quality action plan is long overdue. We have therefore appointed consultants to undertake the task of producing an air quality strategy and action plan.
Thank you, councillors. Those are all the questions I have in part 2 of the 2 executive meetings. I therefore ask council if they would be happy to receive and note the executive minutes of the 18th of January and the 8th of February. Is that agreed? Thank you very much, councillors. The next item is in my hands, which is dealing with the Standards and General Purposes Committee and laying before you the minutes of their meeting on the 6th of December, and I'm sure I have a seconder.
I'm happy to second, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Goodrich. Councillors, there is one part one item, which is a review of arrangements for dealing with standards allegations against councillors and co-opted members under the Localism Act 2011. When we were debate about, or when I thought we might debate this at our last meeting, I had a fairly lengthy amount to say, and as the meeting got longer and longer, I pruned it and edited it quite considerably. Since we didn't actually get to it, I debated giving you the full version today, but frankly, I think it is a very simple matter, so you're only going to get the edited version, which I hope you will find sufficient. For a long time, there has been concerns amongst the council and councillors that when proceedings are being thought about or proceedings being taken to deal with complaints about councillors, that it has taken an extraordinarily long time. And this goes back well before COVID, which obviously exacerbated the problem. So what these notes do, and I do think they are, they're probably quite difficult to read, but they do get through the point. We have certain things we have to do. For instance, by law, we have to refer things to an independent person. And what these new items do is they lay down fairly strict timescales on both the poor monitoring officer on my right, and also on those about whom the complaint has been raised, and also those who are raising the complaint, to try and move these things forward in a more timely manner. And I'm sure we'd all be pleased to see that. I have high hopes that the administration will be happy with this. And I also have high hopes that the opposition will be happy with this, as they actually, for a strange reason, formed a majority on the committee that considered it. So basically, that is our recommendation. It is meant to speed up things, make them more clear, but basically, as we all know, justice delayed is justice denied, and we are attempting to remove the delay on justice. I don't know if anybody wishes to speak to this. Please go ahead, you're hidden behind someone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I'm not happy about this at all at the beginning of the process. I noticed this on page 527, making a complaint, point 3. The monitoring officer has a statutory responsibility for maintaining, I can't see it in the slide, sorry, maintaining the register of councillors' interests and is responsible for dealing with complaints about councillor misconduct. If we go over the page, we see page 3.3.4, where a complaint concerns an issue between two councillors. The monitoring officer will initially refer the matter to the appropriate group leaders. Now, first of all, I think will should be changed and replaced with the word may. And secondly, what if the complaint is about one of the group leaders? I suppose that would be, I'd like to see that spelt out a little bit more definitely. I'd like to see that actually written into this policy. And the other thing is, the group leaders, are they going to have any training in resolving arguments between councillors? Is there some sort of training programme that you're planning? It's 28 days is being allowed for them to try and sort out an argument or a disagreement or a complaint. 28 days is a long time. That's 4 weeks before the monitoring officer really needs to get involved. I don't think that's good enough. I'm sorry. So I won't be able to support this merely on that. I'm sure the rest of the document is wonderful, but the beginning of the process is not satisfactory as far as I'm concerned. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Ells. Councillor Cossa and then the leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Mayor. As a member of the Standards Committee, I took part in that debate, and I accept that we did have a pretty rigorous debate. The only point I wanted to make this evening is this: that what that debate was about inevitably was about the process and about the procedures. And this is always a tricky area. It's about the what ifs, and to some extent you do your very best to try and work out what happens if this and what happens if that. And I think we've made a reasonable fist of it with the help of the monitoring officer. But there's one thing I do want to record, because with another hat on behalf of towns and parishes in Surrey, we've been doing a lot of lobbying and a lot of work to point out that one of the great problems with the code of conduct is a huge amount of resource and time and effort can go into dealing with tricky areas. But if there is an outcome that finds someone culpable, there is effectively no sanction. And some are beginning to question whether the whole code of conduct process is worth it. Now, that's something that's being taken up at national level, but I do hope, and I'm new to this in terms of Waverley at least, I do hope at some time that is something that this council can draw its own mind to, and we can have an opportunity to discuss, because it's a pretty toothless process at the moment. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Cossa. Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I also attended that debate of standards, and it was a useful and interesting session. Just to quickly respond to Councillor Ells, it would be my understanding, and I'm sure can be confirmed by officers if need be, that if a group leader was involved, it would of course be completely inappropriate to refer it to them, as they would be the subject, and it would then need to move on to the stage that follows that, so that it would be done correctly. In regards to the comments regarding group leaders training, I absolutely completely agree. A function of a group leader's job, if this is going to be part of that job, firstly should be something that members obviously are thinking about when they elect their group leader, but I think there should be some ability to provide upon request additional training for group leaders who feel they need additional support to undertake that duty. I have not had to arbitrate any disputes within my group, and I won't speculate as to why that is, because frankly everybody's fantastic in the Liberal Democrat group, as I'm obviously going to say. But I think if there are issues where you've got a tricky matter to resolve, my assumption would be that the group leader can call on the assistance of Democratic Services and the monitoring officer, or potentially request additional training if this is something that is coming up frequently as part of their group activity. I have no doubt the monitoring officer would probably agree with that process, but thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. Any more speakers? Okay, in that case, sorry,
Yes,
Councillor Hyman, I didn't see you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Yes, I share the concerns of Councillor Cossa. I've probably got more experience of the complaints system than most. I went through a 2.5-year process, which started with me in my very first, I think it was, planning meeting, when after I was elected in 2016, I think it was October 2016, I used the term misquoted chairman in public, talking to the chairman, and 2.5 years later I had to suffer a re-education with a cup of tea with a couple of very nice people down at Farnham Town Council, and I shudder to think how much time, I mean, what a complete waste of time. The reason, of course, was that I had pointed out what the law states in respect of habitats, and I had to be shut up. And I had to be taught a lesson. This is any resident who saw
Councillor, I really don't want to rerun your standards hearing. I'd like comments on the papers, please.
Well, yes, I mean, this is what we've got in front of us really is just housekeeping and tidying things up. But the whole point is that shuffling bits of paper around because the system doesn't work. Any resident looking at it would just think of this as a kangaroo court. So there is no way of ensuring truthfulness, which is the basis of the within our system, which is the basis of the Nolan principles and the basis of code of conduct. There is no way of assuring accountability. We cannot get a question answered. We need an overall duty of candour, the ability to get a question answered. And I've proved repeatedly over 15 years that that's not something that happens at Waverley unless you ask easy questions.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. I will sum up then. I'm sorry, I totally disagree with Councillor Else. I'm generally a great believer in flexibility, but I do not think may is the right word. I think will, which is in there, is the right word. And I would want the monitoring officer to definitely do that. Referring to the group leader, I referred in my lead into this to try and get things done a little more quickly. I perhaps should also have said a little less formally if possible. And I thoroughly support the idea of going to the group leader and saying, look, your councillor is doing this, that and the other. Can you please have a word with them and let's get this sorted out without going through a formal process? I think that is probably one of the best things we put in there, and I strongly, strongly support it. I totally agree with Councillor Cotter. It is a process which forces us to devote an awful lot of time, money and effort into achieving a process which at the end has no sanctions of any reasonable effect whatsoever. It is a ludicrous process that was taken away from councils, oh God, I think about 7 or 8 years ago, probably longer, by an ill-fated Secretary of State. But that's what we're stuck with at the moment. And yes, I have, in my position as leader, asked the LGA independent leader to take this up, and I'm sure that other groups have also asked their leaders to take it up. We can only deal with what we're allowed to deal with. The legislation prohibits us from having strong sanctions. The legislation insists that we go through what is seen as a fair process. And picking up the 28 days, I have some sympathy with what Councillor Else said, but this was discussed in depth with the monitoring officer, and with the tripartite delays between those who are being potentially investigated, those who are complaining, and those officers who are trying to put it together, it seemed certainly a reasonable number, and certainly rather better than the 2.5 years which Councillor Hyman has quoted us, which I hope will never happen again. So unless my deputy chairman wishes to speak, I will put it to council. Is this approved? Is this agreed? Thank you very much, councillors. You can indeed.
Is that voting against? Yeah, that's recorded.
The next item is a name change for the Policy Overview and Scrutiny Committee. To give you a little bit of background, when we were setting up these committees, there, like everything, was a lot of argument about a few things, but interestingly, the name was perhaps one of the things which ensued the biggest debate. The committee has now, excuse me, felt that we should change the name. And frankly, if they're going to work on the committee, I think that is perfectly reasonable. So what we are putting forward is that Policy Overview and Scrutiny Committee should change to Resources Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I hope everybody is content with that. There is no bias or anything in that. Is that agreed? Thank you very much. I wish councillors that I could just say, let's move into exempt. But unfortunately, the regulations are such that I have to speak to you at great length with a great many numbers, most of which I hope I will get right. But councillors, pursuant to Procedure Rule 20, and in accordance, the lighting in here is absolutely terrible, in accordance with section 100A brackets 4 of the Local Government Act 1972, the press and public be excluded from the meeting during the consideration of the following matter on the grounds that it is likely, in view of the nature of the business to be transacted or the nature of the proceedings, that if members of the public were present during this item, that there would be disclosures to them of exempt information as defined by section 100I of the Act, of the description specified in paragraph 3 of the revised part 1 of the Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act. Information relating to the finances or business, financial or business affairs of any particular person, including the authority holding that information. I'm sure everybody thoroughly understood that, but basically, can I have your agreement to go into exempt?